The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the mahogany dining table as I sat in my childhood seat, the same worn velvet chair I'd occupied for 32 years of family dinners. The irony wasn't lost on me that in less than 6 hours I would be making decisions that could reshape American foreign policy, yet here I was, being lectured about my life choices over my mother's famous pot roast. "Rachel, sweetheart," my mother, Patricia Morrison, said as she passed the mashed potatoes, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal disappointment I knew so well. "I was talking to Linda Chen from the country club yesterday. Her daughter just made partner at Goldman Sachs. Partner, Rachel, at 29. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." I took a measured bite of my food, tasting nothing. The familiar weight of expectation pressed against my chest like a lead blanket. Around this table, I would always be the Morrison daughter who couldn't quite get her act together, the one who chose the wrong career path, the family disappointment disguised in a sensible blazer and modest jewelry. My father, Robert Morrison, cleared his throat, that authoritative sound that had commanded boardrooms for 3 decades before his retirement. He was a man built from ambition and quarterly reports, his silver hair perfectly styled even at Sunday dinner. "Your mother has a point, Rachel. This government work of yours. It's been, 8 years now? And you're still in the same position. There's no real advancement in the public sector." I almost laughed. If only he knew that tomorrow morning, I would be chairing a classified committee meeting that would determine America's response to an emerging international crisis. If only he understood that the government work he dismissed so casually had taken me from a junior policy analyst to the youngest woman ever elected to the United States Senate from California. But that was the thing about my family. They saw only what they wanted to see, heard only what confirmed their preconceived notions about success and failure. My brother Michael, 3 years younger and everything my parents had ever dreamed of in a son, leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who had never known real struggle. He'd inherited our father's broad shoulders and commanding presence, along with his talent for making money. At 29, he was already a senior vice president at a major tech company, driving a Tesla Model S and living in a penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay. "Dad's right, Ratch," Michael said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "I mean, I'm not trying to be harsh here, but you're 32. Most of my colleagues your age are already on their 2nd or 3rd promotions. Some are starting their own companies. You're still working for someone else, still renting that tiny apartment in Sacramento." The apartment he referred to was indeed small. A modest 2-bedroom that I kept for appearances, for nights when I needed to be near the state capitol. He had no idea about the secure townhouse in Georgetown, the one with bulletproof windows and a direct line to the White House Situation Room. He knew nothing about the late-night calls from world leaders, the classified briefings that arrived in armored cars, the weight of national security decisions that kept me awake until dawn. "Michael," my mother said, though her tone suggested agreement rather than reproach, "be gentle with your sister. Not everyone can be as driven as you are." Driven. The word hung in the air like an accusation. In their minds, I lacked drive. I was the dreamer, the idealist, the one who had chosen passion over profit. They remembered the girl who had majored in political science instead of business, who had turned down lucrative offers from consulting firms to work for a barely known congressman's campaign. They saw only failure where I had built something extraordinary. My sister-in-law, Jennifer, Michael's wife of 2 years, offered what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile. She was beautiful in the way that money could buy. Personal trainer, nutritionist, stylist, dermatologist. And she wore her privilege like expensive perfume, subtle but unmistakable. "You know, Rachel," Jennifer said, her voice honeyed with false concern, "my friend Ashley works in HR for this amazing startup in Silicon Valley. They're always looking for people with government experience. I could put in a word for you. It's not too late to make a real career change." A real career change. The words struck me like physical blows. If only they knew that 6 months ago I had been personally briefed by the Secretary of State on a diplomatic crisis that could have triggered a war. If only they understood that my, quote, government experience included classified operations that would remain secret for decades, victories that would never appear on any resume or LinkedIn profile. But this was my reality, two separate worlds that could never intersect. In one world, I was Senator Rachel Morrison, the youngest woman to chair the Senate Intelligence Committee, a rising star in American politics with a security clearance that gave me access to the nation's deepest secrets. In the other, I was just Rachel, the family disappointment who still rented instead of owned, who drove a practical Honda Civic instead of a luxury car, who showed up to family dinners in off-the-rack clothes instead of designer labels. The conversation continued around me, a familiar symphony of success stories and gentle criticisms. Michael talked about his latest promotion, his stock options, his plans to buy a vacation home in Napa. Jennifer mentioned her yoga instructor certification and the charity board she'd joined, activities that filled her days, while Michael climbed the corporate ladder. My mother shared updates from her social circle, each story carefully chosen to highlight another path I hadn't taken. Sarah Goldman's daughter had just gotten engaged to a cardiologist. The Martinez family's youngest had been accepted to Harvard Law School. The Patel girl had started her own fashion line and was already profitable. I listened with the patience I'd learned from years of congressional hearings, nodding at appropriate moments, asking polite questions, playing my assigned role in this weekly theater of family dynamics. But beneath the surface, my mind was already shifting to tomorrow's agenda. At 7 a.m., I would be receiving a classified briefing on emerging threats in Southeast Asia. At 9 a.m., I had a meeting with the Speaker of the House about emergency appropriations. At 11 a.m., I would be questioning the Director of the FBI about domestic terrorism threats. "You know what your problem is, Rachel?" my father said, setting down his wine glass with a definitive clink. His words carried the weight of final judgment, the pronouncement of a man accustomed to being right. "You never learn to think strategically about your career. You follow your heart instead of your head. That's admirable in theory, but it doesn't pay the bills or build a future." Strategic thinking. The irony was so profound it was almost painful. Just last month, I had authored a classified report on strategic defense initiatives that had been circulated to every member of the National Security Council. I had spent weeks analyzing intelligence reports, coordinating with military leaders, and developing policy recommendations that would shape America's defense posture for the next decade. But to my father, I was still the impractical dreamer who had chosen public service over profit margins. "Robert," my mother said, placing a gentle hand on his arm, "let's not be too hard on Rachel. She's doing important work, even if it doesn't come with the recognition that other careers might offer." Important work without recognition. The phrase captured everything they didn't understand about my life. They measured success in newspaper headlines and salary figures, in corner offices and company cars. They couldn't comprehend a world where the most important work happened in shadows, where the greatest victories were the disasters that never occurred, the wars that never started, the attacks that were prevented before they could unfold. My phone, sitting silently beside my plate, contained messages from senators, cabinet members, and intelligence officials. Tomorrow's schedule included calls with foreign ministers and a classified briefing that would require me to make decisions affecting millions of lives. But here, in this dining room where family portraits smiled down from wallpapered walls, I was still just the daughter who couldn't quite measure up. The evening wore on with the predictable rhythm of family gatherings. My mother served her famous apple pie, the recipe passed down from her own mother, while my father told stories from his business days that we'd all heard countless times before. Michael showed photos from his latest business trip to Japan, where he'd closed a multi-million-dollar deal that would earn him another promotion. I found myself studying their faces in the warm light of the chandelier, these people who shared my blood but not my world. They loved me, I knew that, but their love came wrapped in disappointment, seasoned with the persistent belief that I was somehow wasting my potential. As the evening drew to a close and we began the familiar ritual of clearing dishes and saying goodbyes, I felt the weight of my double life settling on my shoulders like a familiar coat. In a few hours, I would slip back into my real identity, become the senator whose voice carried weight in the halls of power, whose decisions rippled through the corridors of government. But for now, I was still just Rachel Morrison, the family failure, gathering my purse and car keys, accepting my mother's leftovers in a plastic container, promising to call more often and take better care of myself. The performance was flawless, honed by years of practice. They had no idea that tomorrow would bring a series of events that would shatter their carefully constructed image of their disappointing daughter forever. The fluorescent lights of the Sacramento government building hummed overhead as I sat in what my family believed was my real office, a cramped cubicle in the Department of Social Services that I maintained as part of my cover. The beige walls were decorated with motivational posters about teamwork and perseverance, the kind of corporate inspiration that felt hollow and manufactured. My supposed supervisor, Janet Walsh, a kind woman in her 50s who was actually a retired CIA operative, played her role perfectly. "Rachel, honey," Janet said, approaching my desk with a stack of fake case files, "don't forget you have that training seminar on new benefits procedures this afternoon. I know it's tedious, but it's important for your professional development." I nodded, playing along with the charade while simultaneously reviewing classified intelligence reports hidden beneath the mundane paperwork. This elaborate performance had been necessary since my election to the Senate 6 years ago. My family needed to believe I was still struggling in middle management, still grinding away at a thankless government job that barely paid the bills. The irony was suffocating. While they pitied my lack of advancement, I was actually one of the most powerful people in the American government, with access to intelligence that would terrify most citizens. But the nature of my real work demanded this deception, this careful construction of mediocrity that allowed me to move through the world unrecognized and underestimated. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Hey sis, found a great job posting for a marketing manager position at my company. Starting salary is more than you probably make in 2 years. Want me to put in a word? It's never too late to start over. Start over." The words burned as I read them. If only he knew that last month I had been the deciding vote on a defense spending bill worth $800 billion. If only he understood that foreign dignitaries flew across oceans to seek my counsel, that presidents called me personally when international crises erupted. My mind drifted back to my college graduation, a day that should have been a celebration but instead became another showcase of family disappointment. I had graduated summa cum laude from UC Berkeley with a degree in political science and international relations, but instead of pride, I saw only concern in my parents' eyes. "Political science," my father had said at the graduation dinner, his voice heavy with the weight of dashed expectations. "Rachel, sweetheart, what are you going to do with political science? Teach high school civics? Work for some nonprofit that can barely keep the lights on?" My mother had tried to soften the blow as she always did. "Maybe she could go to law school, Robert. Lots of successful people start with political science and then become lawyers. The Weinstein boy did that, and now he's making 6 figures at that firm downtown." I had tried to explain my vision, my dreams of public service, and making a difference in people's lives. But they heard only impracticality, only a young woman too naive to understand how the world really worked. When I announced my intention to volunteer for Congressman Peter Caldwell's campaign instead of pursuing a corporate internship, the disappointment was palpable. "You're volunteering?" Michael had asked, incredulous. He was a senior in business school then, already fielding multiple job offers with starting salaries that dwarfed what I might earn in my first decade of public service. "Rachel, you can't build a career on volunteering. You need to think about your financial future." But I had seen something in Congressman Caldwell's campaign that my family couldn't understand. An opportunity to learn from the inside how real change happened, how policy was crafted and implemented, how the machinery of democracy actually functioned. While they saw me stuffing envelopes and making phone calls for free, I was absorbing lessons in political strategy that would serve me for the rest of my career. The pattern continued through my 20s, each family gathering becoming another opportunity for well-meaning interventions about my career choices. When I was promoted to deputy campaign manager for Caldwell's re-election, my father's response was telling. "Deputy campaign manager," he repeated, as if testing the words for substance. "And what does that pay, exactly?" When I told him the modest salary, his face fell. Michael, by then pulling in a six-figure income at a tech startup, had actually winced in sympathy. Jesus, Rachel, I spend more than that on my car payment and insurance. How do you even live on that? They didn't understand that I wasn't living on just that salary. By then, I was already receiving classified briefings as part of my security clearance for working with Caldwell on the Intelligence Committee. I was sitting in on meetings that shaped national policy, contributing to decisions that affected millions of lives. But those contributions were invisible to my family, lost in the classified shadows of government work. The breaking point came during my 30th birthday party, a gathering my mother had organized at their country club, complete with all the trappings of upper-middle-class respectability. The guest list read like a roster of my parents' social ambitions, successful couples from their circle, each with children who had achieved the kind of conventional success that made for easy dinner party conversation. I remember standing in the club's oak-paneled dining room, nursing a glass of wine while my mother regaled her friends with updates about Michael's latest promotion. Vice President at 31, she was saying, her voice bright with maternal pride. And they're already talking about him for the executive track. He's just so driven, so focused on building something meaningful. Then the conversation turned to me, and I watched my mother's expression shift subtly, the way it always did when she had to explain my life choices to her social circle. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Rachel is still with the government, she said, the words chosen carefully to suggest stability while avoiding specifics. She's very dedicated to public service. It's admirable, really, even if it's not, well, even if the compensation doesn't reflect the importance of the work. Mrs. Hamilton, the wife of a prominent banker, leaned in with the kind of conspiratorial whisper that wealthy women used when discussing other people's misfortunes. Oh, Patricia, I understand completely. My nephew went through a phase like that after college, wanted to save the world, work for some environmental group. But eventually he came to his senses. Went to business school, got his MBA, now he's doing very well in consulting. A phase. That's what they thought my entire adult career was. A prolonged adolescent rebellion that I would eventually outgrow. They were waiting for me to come to my senses, to abandon my foolish idealism and join the real world of profit margins and quarterly earnings. Later that evening, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, my father pulled me aside for one of his heart-to-heart conversations. We stood on the club's terrace, looking out over the manicured golf course, the fairways lit by soft spotlights that made everything look artificial and perfect. "Rachel," he began, his voice carrying the weight of paternal concern, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I want you to know that your mother and I are prepared to help you make a change. If you want to go back to school, get your MBA or maybe a law degree, we'll support you financially. It's never too late to redirect your career towards something more substantial." Substantial. The word hit me like a physical blow. Everything I had accomplished, every briefing I had attended, every policy decision I had influenced, none of it was substantial in his eyes because none of it came with a corner office or a six-figure salary. "Dad," I had said, choosing my words carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but I love what I do. I'm making a difference." He had smiled then, the patronizing smile of a parent indulging a child's fantasy. "I know you think you are, sweetheart. But at some point, you have to ask yourself whether you're really making the kind of difference that justifies the sacrifice. You're 30 years old, and you're still living paycheck to paycheck. You don't own property, you don't have significant savings, you're not building anything for your future." What he didn't know was that I owned property, a secure townhouse in one of Washington's most exclusive neighborhoods, purchased through a complex arrangement that kept my name off public records. What he couldn't see were the investments I had made with my senatorial salary, carefully managed through blind trusts to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest. But more than the financial misunderstanding was the deeper failure to comprehend what I was building. I wasn't constructing a portfolio or a real estate empire. I was building something far more valuable and infinitely more fragile: influence, relationships, expertise in the machinery of power. I was becoming someone whose phone calls got returned, whose opinions carried weight, whose vote could shift the balance of American policy. The most painful part of these family interventions was their genuine love and concern. They weren't being cruel. They were trying to save me from what they perceived as a life of noble poverty and professional insignificance. In their world, success was measured in tangible achievements: the size of your house, the make of your car, the exclusivity of your zip code. They couldn't understand that real power often looked mundane from the outside, that the most important decisions were made in windowless rooms by people whose names never appeared in headlines. They had no frame of reference for understanding that their daughter, the family disappointment, was actually one of the most influential women in America. The pattern had become so predictable that I could map it like a mathematical equation. Every family gathering would include at least one conversation about my career prospects, one suggestion for a better job, one expression of concern about my financial future. They offered connections, job leads, even direct financial assistance to help me transition to something more appropriate for a woman of my education and family background. And I accepted it all with grace, playing my role in this elaborate performance while simultaneously carrying the weight of national security decisions that would have staggered them. I listened to their advice about networking and professional development, while secretly coordinating with intelligence agencies on matters of international importance. The cognitive dissonance was becoming harder to bear with each passing year. How long could I maintain this dual existence? How many more family dinners could I endure, sitting silently while they discussed my wasted potential and lack of direction? But the alternative, revealing the truth, was impossible. My work demanded secrecy, not just for my own protection, but for the security of the nation itself. The moment my family learned I was Senator Morrison, everything would change. The media attention, the security concerns, the complete upheaval of their lives, it would all become unavoidable. So I continued the performance, year after year, family dinner after family dinner, playing the role of the disappointing daughter while secretly wielding power they couldn't even imagine. The secured elevator descended silently through the bedrock beneath the Capitol building, carrying me to a level that didn't appear on any public building schematics. Subbasement Level 7 was home to the Senate Intelligence Committee's Classified Operations Center, a facility so sensitive that even its existence was compartmentalized information. The biometric scanner read my palm print, retinal pattern, and DNA signature before the reinforced steel doors whispered open. "Good morning, Senator Morrison," said Agent Sarah Chen, my security liaison, as I stepped into the operations center. The vast underground space hummed with controlled energy. Dozens of analysts hunched over encrypted workstations, wall-mounted displays showing real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe, and the constant, quiet chatter of secure communications channels. This was my real office, my actual workplace. While my family imagined me pushing papers in a beige cubicle, I was actually commanding one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in the world. The irony never lost its sting. They pitied my lack of professional advancement, while I held one of the most powerful positions in American government. "What's our situation board this morning?" I asked Agent Chen as we walked past banks of quantum computers that processed terabytes of intercepted communications every second. "3 developing situations require your immediate attention, Senator," she replied, handing me a titanium-cased tablet containing the day's classified briefings. "The situation in the South China Sea has escalated overnight. Chinese naval forces have moved 3 destroyer groups into disputed waters, and our Pacific Fleet commanders are requesting guidance on rules of engagement." I absorbed the information while walking toward the committee's secure conference room, my mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had served me through 6 years of navigating international crises. This was the work that truly mattered, decisions that could prevent wars or trigger them, intelligence assessments that shaped the balance of global power. The conference room itself was a marvel of secure architecture. The walls contained layers of copper mesh that blocked all electronic signals, while white noise generators prevented any form of acoustic surveillance. When the committee met here, we were completely isolated from the outside world, free to discuss the most sensitive matters of national security. "Senator Morrison," called out Director James Patterson of the Central Intelligence Agency as I entered the room. He was a tall, thin man, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the world's most dangerous places. We've been monitoring the overnight developments in Beijing. Their military leadership is taking a more aggressive stance than our previous assessments indicated. Around the table sat the other members of the committee, senators from both parties who had been entrusted with the nation's deepest secrets. Senator Williams from Texas, a former Army general who understood military strategy better than most Pentagon officials. Senator Rodriguez from Florida, whose expertise in Latin American affairs had guided U.S. policy for over a decade. Senator Thompson from Maine, a former prosecutor whose skills at interrogation had proved invaluable in oversight hearings. These were my true peers, the people who understood the weight of the decisions we made in this room. Unlike my family, they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. In their eyes, I wasn't a disappointment or a failure. I was a colleague whose judgment they trusted with matters of life and death. "What's the intelligence assessment on Chinese intentions?" I asked, settling into my chair at the head of the table. As committee chair, I had the responsibility of synthesizing complex information from multiple agencies and making recommendations that would flow directly to the president's desk. "Mixed signals," Director Patterson replied, activating a holographic display that showed the current positions of naval forces throughout the region. Their public statements suggest they're conducting routine training exercises, but the deployment patterns indicate preparation for something more significant. We're seeing supply ships positioning for extended operations, electronic warfare units moving into forward positions. Senator Williams leaned forward, his military training evident in his posture. "What's our fleet's current readiness status? If this escalates, can we respond effectively?" "Admiral Foster is maintaining elevated readiness without provocative positioning," I answered, having been briefed by the Joint Chiefs at 0500 that morning. 3 carrier groups within 12 hours sailing time, submarine assets in theater, but were keeping a respectful distance from the disputed zones. The discussion continued for 2 hours, each detail classified at levels that would remain secret for decades. We analyzed satellite imagery that showed Chinese military movements, reviewed intercepts of encrypted communications between Beijing and their field commanders, and assessed the probable responses of regional allies like Japan and South Korea. This was the reality of my work. Not the mundane government job my family imagined, but the actual machinery of global politics. Every decision we made in this room rippled outward through diplomatic channels, military commands, and intelligence networks. When I voted to authorize additional surveillance assets in the region, those satellites would be repositioned within hours. When I recommended enhanced cooperation with allied intelligence services, secure communications would be established before the day ended. "Senator Morrison," said Director Patterson as the meeting concluded, "the President has requested your personal assessment of Chinese leadership psychology for tomorrow's National Security Council meeting. Given your doctoral work on East Asian political dynamics, your analysis carries particular weight." My doctoral work, another secret my family would never know. While they believed I had stopped my education after my bachelor's degree, I had actually completed a PhD in international relations through a classified program designed for intelligence professionals. My dissertation on Chinese military decision-making had become required reading at the War College, but it existed only in secured archives that would never see public light. After the committee meeting, I walked through the underground corridors toward my actual office, not the cubicle my family knew about, but a suite of rooms that served as my command center for Senate business. My real personal assistant, Marcus Williams, was a former Navy intelligence officer whose security clearance was higher than most cabinet members. "Good afternoon, Senator," Marcus said as I entered the outer office. "The German Chancellor's office called to confirm your encrypted video conference at 1400 hours. The Secretary of Defense wants 15 minutes before your markup session on the Defense Appropriations Bill. And Senator Chen from the Armed Services Committee is requesting a private meeting about the classified amendments to the cyber warfare authorization." This was my actual schedule, not the training seminars and case file reviews that my family thought filled my days, but high-level meetings with world leaders, defense officials, and fellow senators who shaped American policy. Every conversation was consequential. Every decision carried weight that extended far beyond my own career advancement. "Also," Marcus continued, Your secure phone has been buzzing with calls from the State Department. The situation in Ukraine is developing faster than expected, and they need your input on the intelligence sharing protocols with NATO allies. I picked up the encrypted phone, its weight heavier than normal cellular devices due to the quantum encryption hardware embedded within. The caller ID showed only a coded designation, but I recognized the number as belonging to Secretary of State Catherine Walsh. "Senator Morrison," came the Secretary's voice through the secured channel. "We need your committee's immediate attention on the Ukrainian situation. Our assets in Kyiv are reporting unusual Russian military communications that suggest a significant escalation may be imminent." "What kind of escalation?" I asked, already reaching for my classified briefing materials. "Potential deployment of advanced electronic warfare systems near the border. If they implement these systems, our ability to communicate with Ukrainian intelligence services could be severely compromised. We need authorization for enhanced countermeasures." This was the weight of real responsibility. Decisions that could affect the lives of millions of people, the stability of entire regions, the balance of power between nuclear nations. While my family worried about my lack of career advancement, I was actually helping to prevent wars, protect democratic allies, and maintain the delicate equilibrium that kept the world from sliding into chaos. My personal phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Rachel, dear, I've been thinking about our conversation at dinner. There's a wonderful opportunity at the Wilson Foundation. They need someone to coordinate their community outreach programs. It's still nonprofit work, but at least it would be management level. Should I put you in touch with their director?" I stared at the message for a long moment, the cognitive dissonance almost overwhelming. Here I was, having just concluded meetings that would influence American foreign policy for years to come, and my mother was trying to help me find what she considered a better job coordinating community outreach. The Wilson Foundation position would probably pay about $60,000 a year, roughly 1/6 of my actual Senate salary. The management-level responsibility she was so excited about would involve overseeing maybe 3 or 4 employees, while I actually commanded a staff of 47 professionals, including some of the most brilliant minds in intelligence analysis and foreign policy. But I couldn't explain any of this to her. The nature of my work demanded absolute secrecy, not just from the public but from everyone in my personal life who lacked the appropriate clearances. My family couldn't know that their disappointing daughter was actually one of the most powerful people in Washington, that world leaders sought her counsel, that her decisions shaped the course of international events. Later that afternoon, I attended a classified briefing on emerging cyber threats to American infrastructure. The briefing took place in another secured facility, this one located beneath the Pentagon, where military and civilian intelligence officials shared their latest assessments of threats from state-sponsored hackers. "Senator Morrison," said General Robert Hayes, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, "your committee's oversight of cyber defense protocols has been exemplary. The new authorization frameworks you developed have already prevented 3 major attacks on critical infrastructure. 3 major attacks that would never make headlines. Disasters averted through careful intelligence work and proactive defense measures. These were victories that couldn't be celebrated publicly, successes that would remain classified for decades. My family would never know that their underachieving daughter had helped prevent cyber attacks that could have crippled the American economy." As the day continued, I moved through meetings that would have astonished my family if they could have seen them. A video conference with British intelligence officials about a joint operation in the Middle East. A consultation with technology executives about protecting election infrastructure. A strategy session with fellow senators about responses to emerging threats from artificial intelligence. Each meeting reinforced the same reality. In the world that mattered, the world where real decisions were made and real power was exercised, I wasn't a failure or a disappointment. I was a leader whose judgment was trusted, whose expertise was valued, whose vote could shift the balance of American policy. But that world remained invisible to my family, hidden behind layers of classification and security protocols that transformed my actual accomplishments into what appeared to be bureaucratic mediocrity. They saw only what they were allowed to see. A government employee struggling to advance in a system they didn't understand, working for modest pay at a job that seemed to lead nowhere. The truth was so much more complex and so much more significant than they could imagine. While they measured success in corporate promotions and salary increases, I was measuring success in prevented conflicts, protected allies, and defended national interests. While they worried about my financial future, I was helping to secure the future of American democracy itself. As evening approached and my official duties concluded, I prepared to return to my cover identity, to slip back into the role of the disappointing daughter who couldn't quite get her life together. Tomorrow would bring another family interaction, another opportunity for well-meaning advice about my career prospects, another reminder of how little they understood about what I had actually accomplished. But tonight, in the quiet of my real office, surrounded by the evidence of genuine achievement and meaningful work, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Whatever my family might think, I knew the truth about who I was and what I had built. The question was whether that truth would ever see the light of day. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, with elegant gold embossing, the kind of formal stationery that my mother reserved for only the most important social occasions. You are cordially invited to celebrate Michael Morrison's promotion to Senior Vice President and his engagement to Jennifer Walsh, it read in flowing script. Join us for an evening of celebration at the Fairmont Grand Del Mar, Saturday, November 18th, 7 p.m. Black tie required. I stared at the invitation from my real office in the Hart Senate office building, my fingers tracing the raised lettering, while my mind calculated the impossible logistics of attending this family milestone. November 18th was exactly 3 days before the president was scheduled to deliver a classified briefing to Congress about emerging threats in Eastern Europe. It was 2 days before I was supposed to chair a Joint Intelligence Committee hearing that would determine America's response to suspected Russian interference in Allied elections. It was the weekend when every major intelligence agency in the Western world would be looking to me for leadership on a crisis that could reshape the geopolitical landscape. But it was also my brother's engagement party, and my absence would be noted, questioned, and ultimately used as further evidence of my inability to prioritize what really mattered in life. Marcus Williams appeared in my office doorway, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he had news I wouldn't want to hear. Senator, I've reviewed your schedule for the weekend of November 18th. The timing is challenging. Challenging was Marcus's diplomatic way of saying impossible. The weekend my family wanted to celebrate Michael's success was the same weekend when the fate of NATO's intelligence-sharing agreements hung in the balance, when decisions made in secured conference rooms could determine whether democratic institutions survived in 3 different countries. What's the worst-case scenario if I attend the party? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus consulted his encrypted tablet, scrolling through classified schedules and security protocols. You'd missed the preparatory briefing for Monday's committee hearing. The CIA director was planning to share intelligence that won't be available through normal channels. Director Patterson specifically requested your presence because of your expertise in Russian psychological operations. My expertise in Russian psychological operations. Another secret accomplishment that my family would never know about. 2 years ago, I had authored a classified analysis of Russian disinformation campaigns that had become the foundation for American counterintelligence strategy. My recommendations had helped protect election integrity in 6 allied nations, but my family still thought I was struggling to understand basic government procedures. And if I don't attend the party? I continued, though this answer was equally predictable. Your mother has called your cover office 3 times this week, Marcus replied with the slightest hint of amusement. Janet is running out of creative excuses for why you're never available for family events. Yesterday she told your mother you were attending a mandatory training seminar on federal filing procedures. The absurdity of it struck me like a physical blow. While my family worried about my professional development through filing seminars, I was actually attending briefings with the National Security Council, strategy sessions with foreign intelligence services, and classified meetings that would determine America's response to global threats. My secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I recognized immediately, the direct line from the Oval Office. I gestured for Marcus to remain as I answered. Senator Morrison, came the familiar voice of President Katherine Hamilton. I need to discuss the upcoming Intelligence Committee hearing with you personally. Are you available for a brief meeting this afternoon? A personal meeting with the President of the United States about matters of national security scheduled for the same day I needed to RSVP to my brother's engagement party. The parallel realities of my life had never felt more surreal, or more unsustainable? Of course, Madam President, I replied, already knowing that this conversation would make my family situation even more complicated. I can be at the White House within the hour. After ending the call, I looked at Marcus with the exhaustion that came from maintaining an impossible double life for too many years. Schedule the meeting with the president. And call Janet. Tell her to prepare another excuse for why I'll be working late again. The drive to the White House took me through the heart of Washington, past monuments and government buildings that represented the real center of my professional world. In 30 minutes, I would be discussing matters that could affect the lives of millions of people. In 3 hours, I would call my mother to explain why I might be late to Michael's engagement party, carefully crafting lies about bureaucratic obligations and weekend training requirements. The Oval Office was smaller than most people imagined, but the weight of history filled every corner. President Hamilton sat behind the resolute desk, her silver hair catching the afternoon light as she reviewed intelligence reports with the focused intensity that had made her one of the most effective leaders in American history. Senator Morrison, she said, looking up as I entered, thank you for making time on such short notice. The situation in Ukraine has accelerated beyond our initial projections, and I need your assessment of how Congress will respond to our proposed aid package. For the next hour, we discussed classified intelligence about Russian troop movements, analyzed the political implications of various response scenarios, and planned congressional strategy for authorizing military assistance to Democratic allies. This was governance at its highest level. 2 women making decisions that would echo through history, shaping the balance of power between democracy and authoritarianism. Your committee's oversight has been exemplary, President Hamilton said as our meeting concluded. The intelligence frameworks you've developed have given us capabilities we never had before. The prevention of the Baltic cyber attack last month. That was directly attributable to your committee's recommendations. Another prevented disaster. Another victory that would remain classified for decades. My family would never know that their underachieving daughter had helped prevent a cyber attack that could have crippled the infrastructure of 3 NATO allies. As I left the White House, my personal phone buzzed with a call from my mother. The transition from discussing matters of global significance to family logistics was always jarring, like switching between different languages that shared no common vocabulary. Rachel, sweetheart? My mother's voice was bright with excitement. I just wanted to confirm that you received Michael's invitation. Jennifer is so excited about the party. They've invited 200 guests, including several of Michael's colleagues from the executive level. This could be wonderful networking for you, dear. Networking. The word felt hollow after spending an hour discussing international crises with the president. What kind of networking could I possibly need when world leaders already had my direct phone number? I received the invitation, Mom, I said carefully, but I might have some work obligations that weekend. The pause that followed was heavy with familiar disappointment. Work obligations? Rachel, this is your brother's engagement party. Surely your supervisor can manage without you for one evening. My supervisor? If only she knew that I didn't have a supervisor in any conventional sense, that I reported directly to the full Senate through the Intelligence Committee, that my work obligations included classified briefings and national security decisions that couldn't be rescheduled for family convenience. I'm going to try my best to be there, I said, which was true, though the complications she couldn't imagine made it increasingly unlikely. That evening, I returned to my cover apartment in Sacramento, the modest 2-bedroom space that my family believed represented the full extent of my material success. The contrast with my real life was always jarring, from discussing global strategy in the Oval Office to microwaving a frozen dinner in a kitchen with outdated appliances and mismatched dishes. But tonight felt different. The weight of maintaining this deception was becoming unbearable. The cognitive dissonance between my 2 worlds stretching toward a breaking point that I could feel approaching like a gathering storm. I called Jennifer's cell phone, knowing that she would answer with the breathless excitement of a newly engaged woman planning the social event of her season. Rachel! Jennifer's voice was effervescent with joy. I'm so glad you called. I wanted to talk to you about the party. Michael and I have been planning this for months, and it's going to be absolutely magical. The venue overlooks the ocean, we have a string quartet, and the guest list reads like a who's who of San Diego's business community. It sounds beautiful, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I was genuinely happy for Michael and Jennifer. Their love was real, their excitement infectious, their dreams of building a life together touching in its simplicity. I also wanted to ask you about bringing a date, Jennifer continued. I know you've been so focused on work lately, but this might be a wonderful opportunity to meet someone. Several of Michael's colleagues are single, very successful men who might appreciate a woman with your dedication to public service. A woman with my dedication to public service. The phrase captured everything they didn't understand about my life. They saw dedication where there was actually power, public service, where there was actually leadership, a career choice, where there was actually a calling that had shaped the course of international events. I'll probably come alone, I said, which was true for reasons Jennifer couldn't imagine. The security protocols around my real identity made dating virtually impossible, and bringing someone to a family event would require explanations I couldn't provide. Well, we'll just have to introduce you to some eligible bachelors at the party, Jennifer said, with the well-meaning determination of a happy couple who wanted everyone else to share their joy. Michael's friend David just made partner at his consulting firm, and there's this wonderful doctor who works with my father, very handsome, very stable. Another word that felt empty when applied to my actual life. What could be more stable than holding one of the most secure positions in American government, with tenure that lasted 6 years regardless of political changes, with influence that extended across multiple administrations? After ending the call with Jennifer, I sat in my small living room, staring at the invitation that represented an impossible choice. Attend the party and miss classified briefings that could affect national security. Skip the party and provide more evidence to my family that I couldn't prioritize personal relationships, that my mysterious work commitments were more important than the people who loved me. The solution, when it came to me, was both elegant and terrifying. What if there was a way to attend Michael's party without missing my classified obligations? What if the two worlds I had kept so carefully separated could somehow coexist for one evening? The idea was risky beyond measure, requiring coordination with security services, approval from intelligence agencies, and protocols that had never been tested in such a personal context. But as I sat in that modest apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a life that was both completely real and entirely false, I realized that the status quo was no longer sustainable. Something had to give. The deception that had protected my family from the complexities of my real life had also protected them from understanding who I actually was, what I had accomplished, what I had sacrificed to serve my country in ways they couldn't imagine. I picked up my secure phone and called Marcus, knowing that he would still be working despite the late hour. People in our line of work didn't keep conventional schedules. Marcus, I said when he answered, I need you to research something for me. What are the protocols for maintaining security coverage at a private family event? Specifically, what would it take to attend my brother's engagement party without compromising operational security? The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know about the complexity of what I was contemplating. Senator, Marcus said carefully, that would require coordination with multiple agencies, advanced security sweeps, background checks on all attendees, and approval from the highest levels of government. The logistics alone would be extraordinary, I finished for him. I know, but I think it might be time for some extraordinary measures. Are you considering disclosure? Marcus asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Disclosure meant revealing my true identity to my family, ending the deception that had protected both my cover and their safety for 6 years. I'm considering options, I said, which was true but incomplete. What I was really considering was whether the cost of secrecy had finally exceeded its benefits, whether the protection of my family's ignorance was worth the sacrifice of their understanding. I'll research the protocols, Marcus said. But Senator, you should know that once this process begins, there's no going back. Your family's lives would change permanently. Their lives would change, but maybe that change was overdue. Maybe it was time for them to understand that their disappointing daughter had actually become someone whose work mattered, whose decisions carried weight, whose service to the country had taken forms they had never imagined. As I ended the call and prepared for another restless night, I realized that Michael's engagement party had become something much more significant than a family celebration. It had become the catalyst for a decision I had been avoiding for years: whether to continue living a lie that protected everyone but myself, or to risk everything by revealing a truth that could transform our family forever. The invitation sat on my coffee table, cream-colored cardstock that represented an impossible choice between two worlds that had never been meant to collide. In 3 weeks, I would have to decide which world mattered more: the one where I was Senator Rachel Morrison, powerful and respected and influential, or the one where I was just Rachel, the family disappointment who could never quite measure up to expectations. But perhaps, for the first time in my adult life, there was a third option: a world where both versions of myself could finally coexist, where my family could know the truth about who I had become and what I had accomplished in service to something greater than any of us had ever imagined. The Fairmont Grand Del Mar's ballroom was a vision of California elegance, with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean. 200 guests mingled in evening wear, their conversations mixing the clink of champagne glasses with the gentle sound of a string quartet. Michael stood near the entrance in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his arm around Jennifer, who looked radiant in a midnight blue gown that probably cost more than my family thought I made in 3 months. What they didn't know was that 5 black SUVs had swept the perimeter an hour before my arrival, that 3 different government agencies had conducted background checks on every person in this room, and that a team of Secret Service agents were currently positioned throughout the hotel, disguised as waitstaff and maintenance personnel. The security protocols for bringing a sitting senator to an unsecured family event had been extraordinary. Director Sarah Martinez of the FBI had personally overseen the operation, treating it as if we were protecting the president herself. Because in many ways, given my access to classified information and my role in national security decisions, my safety was nearly as critical to American interests. I stood in the hotel's private elevator, my reflection staring back from the polished brass doors. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had attended family dinners for the past 6 years. Tonight, I wore a custom evening gown that had cost more than my supposed monthly salary, jewelry that had been a gift from the French foreign minister's wife, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I had accomplished. Marcus Williams stood beside me, wearing a perfectly fitted tuxedo that made him look like a successful businessman rather than a former Navy intelligence officer with enough security clearance to make generals nervous. "Final status report, Senator," he said quietly. "All security positions confirmed. The team has eyes on every entrance and exit. Your family has no idea about the additional security presence." "And our emergency protocols?" I asked, though I knew Marcus had planned for every contingency. "If the evening proceeds normally, we maintain cover. If any complications arise, we have 3 different extraction routes planned. Agent Chen is monitoring all communications channels from the command post in the hotel's security office." The elevator chimed softly as we reached the ballroom level. Through the opening doors, I could hear the sounds of celebration, laughter, music, the excited conversations of people gathering to honor my brother's success and happiness. In a few minutes, I would rejoin my family as the woman they had always known, playing the familiar role of the underachieving daughter while surrounded by enough security to protect a head of state. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the careful balance I had maintained for 6 years was about to shift in ways that would change everything forever. "Rachel!" My mother's voice cut through the ambient noise as I entered the ballroom. She approached with the graceful glide of a woman who had spent decades navigating social events, her silver hair perfectly styled, her smile bright with maternal pride that was directed entirely toward Michael's achievements. "You look lovely, dear," she said, embracing me with the careful precision of someone wearing expensive fabric. "Though I wish you'd let me introduce you to some of Michael's colleagues. There are several very successful men here tonight who might appreciate meeting someone with your dedication to public service." Before I could respond, my father appeared at her side, looking distinguished in his formal wear. Robert Morrison had always carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his military service decades past, but still evident in his posture and bearing. "Rachel," he said, offering a brief embrace that felt more like a business handshake. "I'm glad you could make it. I know your work schedule can be demanding." If only he knew that my work schedule had included a classified video conference with NATO intelligence chiefs that morning, followed by a briefing with the Joint Chiefs of Staff about emerging threats in 3 different time zones. If only he understood that I had spent the ritual afternoon reviewing intelligence assessments that would determine America's response to attempted interference in Allied elections. "I wouldn't miss Michael's engagement party," I said, which was true despite the extraordinary measures it had required. Michael approached then, his face glowing with the happiness of a man celebrating one of the most important nights of his life. Despite all the family dynamics and professional complications, I felt a genuine surge of affection for my younger brother. His joy was infectious, his love for Jennifer evident in every gesture. "Rachel," he said, pulling me into a hug that was warmer and more genuine than our parents' greetings. "I'm so glad you're here. Jennifer was worried you might get stuck at work again." Stuck at work. The phrase would have been amusing if it weren't so painfully inadequate. That morning, work had included a secure communication with the British Prime Minister about coordinating responses to Russian disinformation campaigns. This afternoon, work had involved reviewing satellite intelligence that could determine whether 3 democratic governments survived the next election cycle. "I made sure to clear my schedule," I said, which was true in ways Michael could never imagine. Jennifer appeared beside him, radiant with happiness and sparkling with jewelry that caught the ballroom's crystal lighting. "Rachel, you look absolutely stunning. That dress is gorgeous. It must have cost a fortune." It had cost a fortune, though not my fortune. The gown was actually a gift from the Italian foreign minister's wife, given to me after a successful intelligence operation that had prevented a terrorist attack on the Vatican. But my family would never know about classified operations or grateful foreign dignitaries who expressed their appreciation through diplomatic channels. "Thank you," I said simply. "You look beautiful, Jennifer. This whole evening is magical." As we talked, I became aware of Marcus moving through the crowd, with the practiced invisibility of a professional security operative. To the other guests, he appeared to be another businessman, perhaps someone's colleague or family friend. But I could see the subtle way he positioned himself to monitor potential threats, the careful attention he paid to crowd movements and exit routes. The evening progressed with the predictable rhythm of high-end social events. I was introduced to Michael's colleagues from the tech company, successful men in their 30s and 40s who spoke knowledgeably about market trends, IPO strategies, and venture capital opportunities. They were accomplished in their fields, leaders in an industry that shaped the global economy, but their conversations felt strangely small after spending my days discussing matters of international security and democratic survival. "Rachel works for the government," Michael explained to a group of his colleagues, his tone carrying the slight embarrassment of a successful man introducing his less accomplished sister. "She's very dedicated to public service." "Government work," said Brad Wellington, a senior vice president who wore his success like expensive cologne. "That's admirable, really. What agency are you with?" "I work in policy analysis," I said, which was technically true though laughably incomplete. Policy analysis in my case involved developing frameworks for international intelligence sharing, creating strategies for defending democratic institutions, and analyzing threats that could destabilize entire regions. "Policy analysis," Brad repeated, nodding with the polite interest of someone making conversation. "That must be challenging. Do you work with the state government or federal?" "Federal," I said, wondering what Brad would think if he knew that my federal work included personal briefings with the president, classified communications with foreign heads of state, and decisions that affected the balance of global power. The conversation continued in this vein, with Michael's colleagues politely inquiring about my career while clearly viewing me as the less successful sibling, the family member who had chosen noble but impractical work over the pursuit of real achievement. Their questions were kind but condescending, their interest genuine but limited. Then everything changed. My secure phone, hidden in my evening bag, began vibrating with the specific pattern that indicated an emergency communication from the highest levels of government. The vibration was subtle, unnoticeable to anyone else, but to me, it was as clear as an air raid siren. I excused myself from the conversation and moved toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, near the windows overlooking the ocean. Marcus appeared beside me instantly, his presence so smooth that it seemed coincidental to any observer. "Emergency communication from the Situation Room," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the party noise. "Priority Alpha classification." Priority Alpha meant imminent threat to national security. The kind of communication that couldn't wait for normal business hours or convenient timing. I glanced around the ballroom, seeing my family and their friends celebrating Michael's engagement, completely unaware that their world was about to intersect with mine in ways that would change everything forever. "I need to take this," I told Marcus, knowing that once I answered this call, there would be no going back to the simple deception I had maintained for 6 years. I moved toward the ballroom's private study, a small room off the main floor where hotel guests could conduct business in relative privacy. Marcus followed, positioning himself to monitor the entrance while I accessed the secure communication channel. The voice that came through the encrypted connection belonged to National Security Advisor General Patricia Collins, a woman whose midnight calls usually preceded major international incidents. Senator Morrison, General Collins's voice was tense with urgency. "We have a developing situation that requires immediate congressional oversight. Russian forces have launched a coordinated cyber attack against 3 NATO allies simultaneously. Initial damage reports suggest critical infrastructure has been compromised in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania." I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied genuine crises, my mind immediately shifting into the analytical mode that had served me through 6 years of international emergencies. "What's the scope of the attack? Are we looking at military infrastructure or civilian targets?" "Both," General Collins replied grimly. "Power grids, communication networks, and financial systems are all reporting significant disruptions. This appears to be a coordinated test of NATO's collective defense capabilities in the cyber domain. A test of NATO's collective defense capabilities." This was exactly the kind of scenario we had been preparing for, the type of crisis that required immediate congressional authorization for enhanced cyber warfare responses. As chair of the Intelligence Committee, my decision could determine whether America responded with restraint or with the full force of our own cyber capabilities. "I need a full briefing within the hour," I said, already calculating the logistics of leaving Michael's party to manage a potential international crisis. "How quickly can you convene an emergency session of the committee?" "Senator," General Collins said, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice, "there's a complication. Intelligence indicates this attack may be a precursor to more aggressive action. We need you back in Washington immediately. The President is convening an emergency National Security Council meeting in 3 hours. 3 hours. I looked through the study's window at the celebration continuing in the ballroom, at my family toasting Michael's engagement, at Jennifer's radiant smile as she showed off her ring to admiring guests. In 3 hours, I needed to be in the White House Situation Room, helping to determine America's response to what could be the opening move of a new kind of warfare. "Understood," I said. "I'll be there." As I ended the secure call, I realized that the moment I had been dreading and anticipating for 6 years had finally arrived. There was no way to disappear from Michael's engagement party without explanation, no excuse that would satisfy my family's questions, no cover story that could explain why their underachieving daughter needed to leave immediately to help manage an international crisis. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression telling me that he understood the implications as clearly as I did. "Senator," he said quietly, "Agent Chen reports that our transportation is standing by. We can have you airborne within 45 minutes. Airborne. Not driving back to Sacramento for another pretend day at my cover job, but flying to Washington in a government aircraft to participate in decisions that could determine whether the crisis escalated into open warfare between nuclear powers." I looked at my reflection in the study's window, seeing a woman caught between 2 worlds that could no longer be kept separate. In the ballroom beyond, my family continued celebrating, completely unaware that their disappointing daughter was about to disappear into a world of classified briefings and national security decisions. But this time, when I left a family event for mysterious work obligations, there would be no cover story adequate to explain my absence. This time, the truth would have to emerge, whether I was ready for it or not. The sound of my family's laughter drifted through the closed door, mixing with the urgent hum of government communications and the weight of impending international crisis. Two worlds, carefully kept separate for 6 years, were about to collide with a force that would change everything forever. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of decision settling around me like armor. It was time to stop being two different people. It was time for my family to meet Senator Rachel Morrison, whether they were ready for that revelation or not. The moment of truth had finally arrived, and there was no going back. I stood in the hotel study for a moment longer, gathering the courage for what I was about to do. Through the closed door, I could hear the sounds of celebration continuing, laughter, clinking glasses, the gentle melody of the string quartet. In a few minutes, I would walk back into that ballroom and shatter the careful illusion I had maintained for 6 years. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped back into the party. The contrast was jarring, moving from a secure communication about international warfare to a celebration where the biggest concern was whether the champagne would last through the evening. Marcus fell into step beside me, his presence somehow more noticeable now that I was no longer trying to hide what he represented. I found my family gathered near the dessert table, where Jennifer was cutting an elaborate engagement cake while photographers captured every moment. Michael stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his face glowing with happiness. My parents flanked them, radiating the proud satisfaction of successful people whose children were following the expected trajectory of achievement and prosperity. "Rachel!" My mother called as she spotted me approaching. "Where did you disappear to?" "Jennifer was just telling us about their honeymoon plans. They're thinking of Europe, maybe Italy and France." "I had to take a work call," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. For 6 years, I had made excuses about work calls that were fictional, cover stories designed to explain mysterious absences. This time, the call had been devastatingly real. "A work call?" My father's voice carried a note of irritation. "Rachel, it's Saturday evening. What kind of work emergency could possibly require your immediate attention? The kind that could determine whether NATO survived intact, whether 3 democratic nations maintained their sovereignty, whether cyber warfare escalated into conventional conflict between nuclear powers." But I couldn't say any of that yet. "It's complicated, Dad," I said, aware that Marcus was positioning himself with clear sightlines to all exits, that somewhere in this ballroom Secret Service agents were monitoring communications for any sign of additional threats. Michael laughed, the good-natured chuckle of a successful man who could afford to be generous with his less fortunate sister. "Come on, Rach. What kind of policy analysis emergency happens on a Saturday night? Did someone misfile a form somewhere?" The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow, but this time, instead of swallowing the hurt and playing my assigned role, I felt something different rising within me. 6 years of hiding, 6 years of accepting their condescension, 6 years of allowing them to believe I was failing at life while I was actually serving my country at the highest levels of government. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying a new edge that made Marcus glance at me sharply, "it's the kind of emergency that requires immediate congressional oversight of international crisis response." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. My family stared at me with the blank confusion of people trying to process information that didn't fit their understanding of reality. "Congressional oversight?" Jennifer asked, her voice uncertain. "Rachel, what are you talking about?" Before I could answer, my secure phone rang again. Not the subtle vibration I had trained myself to notice, but an actual audible ring that cut through the party noise like a siren. Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon as several guests turned to look at the unusual sound. I answered the phone without moving away from my family. "Senator Morrison." The words were out before I could stop them, spoken with the automatic authority of someone who had answered thousands of such calls over the past 6 years. Around me, my family's faces shifted from confusion to shock to something approaching terror. "Senator Morrison," came the voice of CIA Director James Patterson. "The situation has escalated. We have confirmation that the cyber attacks were coordinated with disinformation campaigns and social media. The Russians are testing our full-spectrum response capabilities. Understood, I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my family was staring at me as if I had suddenly sprouted wings. I'll be at the emergency briefing within 3 hours. Have the committee staff prepare a preliminary assessment for congressional review. Thank you, Senator. Your flight is cleared for immediate departure. I ended the call and looked at my family, seeing my own reflection in their shocked faces. My mother's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. My father's face had gone pale, his usual commanding presence replaced by stunned confusion. Michael and Jennifer stood frozen, as if they were watching a movie where the plot had suddenly shifted into an entirely different genre. "Senator?" my mother whispered, the word barely audible above the party noise. "Did that person just call you Senator?" "Yes," I said simply, "because that's who I am. I'm Senator Rachel Morrison, elected to represent California in the United States Senate 6 years ago. I chair the Intelligence Committee, and I'm currently managing a crisis that could determine whether NATO survives the next 24 hours. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the string quartet seemed to fade into background noise as my family processed this information. Other party guests were beginning to notice the strange tableau we had created, but I no longer cared about maintaining appearances. "That's impossible," Michael said, his voice hollow. "You work for social services, you live in that tiny apartment, you drive a Honda Civic." "I maintain a cover identity for security reasons," I explained, feeling the strange relief that came with finally telling the truth. "The apartment and the job are necessary deceptions. My real work requires the highest level of security clearance in the American government." My father found his voice first, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Senator Morrison. You're Senator Morrison. The one who's been on the news, the one who chairs the Intelligence Committee. The one you've been criticizing for being too aggressive on foreign policy," I added, remembering his dinner table rants about senators who didn't understand the real world. "The one you said was too young and inexperienced to handle matters of national security." The irony was perfect and devastating. For years, my father had complained about Senator Morrison's approach to international affairs, never knowing he was criticizing his own daughter's policy decisions. Jennifer's voice was shaky when she finally spoke. "But why? Why would you lie to us for all these years?" "I didn't lie," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they were inadequate. "I maintained operational security. My work involves classified information that could endanger lives if it became public knowledge. Including your lives." "Our lives?" my mother asked, her voice rising with panic. "What do you mean about our lives?" Marcus stepped forward then, his presence suddenly more noticeable as he positioned himself between my family and the other party guests. "Ma'am, perhaps we should move this conversation to a more secure location." "Who is he?" Michael demanded, looking at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. "Is he some kind of bodyguard?" "Marcus Williams, former Navy intelligence, currently serving as Senator Morrison's Chief of Staff and Security Coordinator," Marcus said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of military training. "And yes, part of my job involves protecting the senator and, by extension, her family." "Protecting us from what?" my father asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "From the consequences of being related to someone who makes life or death decisions about national security," I said. "From foreign intelligence services who might try to use you as leverage against me. From domestic terrorists who might target my family to influence my votes. From anyone who might see you as a weakness they could exploit." The weight of this revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were beginning to understand that my failure to build a conventional life wasn't about lack of ambition or poor choices. It was about sacrifice, about accepting isolation and deception to serve something larger than personal success. "The dinner conversations," my mother said suddenly, her face flushing with embarrassment. "All those times we tried to give you career advice, all those job suggestions. You were trying to help someone you thought was struggling," I said gently. "You had no way of knowing that your daughter was actually one of the most powerful people in Washington." "But the money," Jennifer said, still grappling with the practical details. "You always said you couldn't afford things, that you were living paycheck to paycheck. My Senate salary is $174,000 a year, I said, watching their faces as they processed this information. Plus additional compensation for committee leadership. I also own property in Georgetown and maintain investment portfolios that are managed through blind trusts to avoid conflicts of interest. Michael's face was cycling through emotions so quickly it was almost comical. Shock, disbelief, embarrassment, and what looked like the beginning of anger. "You let us pity you," he said, his voice rising. "You sat through all those family dinners, all those conversations about your career, and you let us think you were failing." "I let you think what you needed to think to stay safe," I replied, feeling my own anger beginning to rise. "Do you have any idea what my life is actually like? Do you understand the decisions I make every day, the weight of responsibility I carry?" "Then tell us," my father demanded, his own anger finally breaking through his shock. "If you're so important, if your work is so significant, then explain it to us." "Fine," I said, my voice carrying the cold authority I used in classified briefings. "This morning, I participated in a secure video conference with the intelligence chiefs of 14 NATO allies, coordinating responses to Russian interference in democratic elections. This afternoon, I met with the president in the Oval Office to discuss military aid packages that could determine whether Ukraine remains an independent nation." I paused, watching their faces as they tried to process the magnitude of what I was describing. Last month, I authored legislation that prevented a cyber attack on the American electrical grid. 3 weeks ago, I cast the deciding vote on a defense appropriations bill that funds intelligence operations in 47 countries. Yesterday, I received a classified briefing on emerging threats from artificial intelligence that won't be declassified for 20 years. The ballroom around us had grown quieter, other guests sensing the tension in our group and giving us space while pretending not to listen. But I was beyond caring about appearances. "And tonight," I continued, "while you're celebrating Michael's engagement, I need to leave this party to help manage a coordinated cyber attack against 3 of our allies that could trigger the first cyber warfare invocation of NATO's Article 5 Collective Defense Clause." The silence that followed was deafening. My family stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, struggling to reconcile the woman they had known with the reality I was describing. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Why didn't you trust us with the truth?" The question hit me harder than any of their earlier criticisms. Why hadn't I told them? Was it really about security, or was it about something deeper? About protecting myself from their judgment? About maintaining the possibility that they might love me regardless of my unconventional choices? "Because," I said, my voice softer now, "because I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, you might still find ways to be disappointed in me. Because I was afraid that even being a United States Senator wouldn't be enough to earn your respect." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest, and more vulnerable than anything I had shared in years of classified briefings and high-stakes negotiations. My secure phone buzzed again, and Marcus caught my eye. "Senator, we need to move. The situation is escalating." I looked at my family one last time, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. They weren't the judgmental critics I had made in my mind. They were people who loved me but didn't understand me, people who had been trying to help someone they thought was struggling. "I have to go," I said. "There are decisions that need to be made, and I'm one of the few people authorized to make them." "Wait," Michael said, reaching out as if to stop me. "You can't just drop this bomb and leave. We need to talk about this. We need to understand." "Later," I said firmly. "Right now, I have a job to do. A job that might prevent a war." As I turned to leave, I heard my father's voice behind me, quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Senator Morrison," he said, using my title for the first time, "we'll be here when you get back. We'll figure this out." I paused at the ballroom entrance, looking back at my family one last time. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that their understanding of the world had been fundamentally incomplete. "I hope so," I said. "Because I'm tired of being two different people. I want to be your daughter and Senator Morrison. I want to finally be whole." Then Marcus and I walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the celebration and the family I loved, walking toward a crisis that required the full attention of the woman I had always been but never been allowed to show them. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my Georgetown townhouse, watching the morning sun stream through bulletproof windows that my family now knew weren't just an expensive security upgrade, but a necessary protection for someone in my position. The kitchen itself was a study in contradictions. Warm cherry cabinets and granite countertops that spoke of home and comfort, alongside secure communication equipment and encrypted tablets that never stopped humming with the urgent business of governance. My mother sat at the breakfast table, reading the Washington Post with the careful attention of someone still learning to navigate her daughter's public life. 6 months ago, she had never heard of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Now she could discuss the intricacies of intelligence oversight with the fluency of someone who had spent countless hours trying to understand a world she never knew existed. "The article about your committee's cybersecurity legislation is on page 4, she said, looking up with a smile that still carried traces of amazement. "They're calling it the most comprehensive reform of digital defense protocols in 20 years. The most comprehensive reform of digital defense protocols in 20 years. The phrase would have been meaningless to her before Michael's engagement party. Now she understood that those protocols were the reason Russian hackers hadn't succeeded in crippling American infrastructure. That her daughter's work was literally protecting the foundation of democratic society. "Coffee's fresh," I said, pouring myself a cup from the machine that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Dad should be here soon for our morning briefing." Our morning briefing. The phrase still felt surreal, but it had become our new routine. Every Sunday, my father joined me for what we called a family security update. A classified briefing that helped him understand the broader context of my work without compromising operational details. It was a compromise we had developed with the help of the FBI's Family Protection Unit, a way for my parents to understand my life without putting national security at risk. The doorbell chimed with the distinctive pattern that indicated an expected visitor who had passed through multiple security checkpoints. My father's voice came through the intercom, still slightly formal when dealing with the security protocols that now governed family visits. "Good morning, Rachel. It's Dad." I pressed the entry button and watched through the security monitor as Robert Morrison walked through the reinforced entry hall, his movements more confident now that he had grown accustomed to the biometric scanners and metal detectors that protected his daughter's home. 6 months ago, this level of security would have seemed like paranoia. Now he understood it as a necessary reality of loving someone whose decisions affected the balance of global power. "Morning, sweetheart," he said as he entered the kitchen, embracing me with a warmth that still felt new and precious. The formal distance that had characterized our relationship for so many years had been replaced by something deeper, not just love, but respect, understanding, and a pride that was based on knowledge rather than assumption. "Senator Morrison," he added with a slight smile, using my title in the affectionate way that had become his method of acknowledging both my professional achievements and his own previous blindness to them. "Just Rachel on Sundays," I reminded him, though I appreciated the gesture. The careful balance between my public and private identities was still evolving, still requiring constant negotiation between the demands of security and the needs of family connection. My mother looked up from her newspaper, her face brightening in the way that still surprised me. For 32 years, I had been accustomed to seeing disappointment or concern in her expressions when she looked at me. Now I saw pride, genuine excitement about my accomplishments, and the kind of maternal satisfaction that came from finally understanding her daughter's life. "Robert, you should see today's editorial about Rachel's Foreign Policy Committee," she said, folding the paper to show him the relevant section. "They're calling her approach to international intelligence, sharing, quote, visionary and pragmatic." Visionary and pragmatic. 6 months ago, those words would have been applied to Michael's business strategies or Jennifer's wedding planning. Now my mother collected newspaper clippings about my legislative achievements with the same enthusiasm she had once reserved for Michael's corporate promotions. We settled around the breakfast table, a scene that looked deceptively normal from the outside but represented a complete transformation of our family dynamics. The conversation that followed would have been impossible before that night at Michael's engagement party, when years of careful deception had finally collapsed under the weight of international crisis. "How did the NATO Intelligence Summit go this week?" my father asked, his question reflecting a knowledge base that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He had spent countless hours educating himself about international affairs, reading policy papers and intelligence analyses that helped him understand the world his daughter inhabited. Productive, I said, knowing I could share general outcomes without compromising classified details. We've established new protocols for rapid response to cyber threats. The framework we developed should prevent the kind of coordinated attack we saw in November. The coordinated attack that had forced my revelation at Michael's party. The crisis that had required me to choose between maintaining family deceptions and fulfilling my responsibilities to national security. Looking back, I realized that moment had been inevitable. The two halves of my life had been moving toward collision for years. "And the confirmation hearing for the new CIA director?" my mother asked. She had watched the entire proceeding on C-SPAN, something that would have been unimaginable when she thought her daughter was struggling in middle management. "Director Chen performed excellently," I replied. "The committee was unanimous in our recommendation. She'll be confirmed by the full Senate next week." We talked for another hour about my work, about the legislation I was developing, about the international relationships that shaped American foreign policy. It was the kind of conversation I had never imagined having with my family, a discussion that treated my career as what it actually was: important, complex, and worthy of respect rather than pity. But the most significant change wasn't in how they viewed my work, it was in how they viewed me. Michael appeared at the kitchen door, looking slightly uncertain in the way that had become familiar over the past 6 months. Our relationship was still being rebuilt, still recovering from years of misunderstanding and the shock of discovering that his, quote, failing sister was actually more successful than he had ever imagined. "Morning, everyone," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone still learning to navigate new family dynamics. "Sorry I'm late. Jennifer had a doctor's appointment." Jennifer was 4 months pregnant with their first child, a development that had added another layer of complexity to our evolving family relationships. She was still processing the revelation that her sister-in-law was one of the most powerful women in Washington, that family gatherings now required security clearances and background checks. "How is Jennifer feeling?" my mother asked, shifting immediately into grandmother mode. Despite all the changes in our family, some things remained constant. My mother's excitement about becoming a grandmother transcended even the shock of learning her daughter was a United States senator. "Better," Michael said, settling into the chair beside me. "The morning sickness is finally starting to ease up." He paused, looking at me with an expression that had become familiar. A mixture of pride, confusion, and something that might have been awe. "Rachel," he said, "I wanted to thank you again for arranging the security consultation for the baby. I know we don't really understand why it's necessary, but—" "It's necessary because you're my family," I said simply. "Because people who want to influence my votes or access my information might see you as potential leverage. Because protecting you protects me, and protecting me protects the work I do." The security consultation had been one of the most practical consequences of my revelation. The FBI's Family Protection Unit had conducted a comprehensive threat assessment and determined that Michael and Jennifer's child would require certain protective measures. Not the extensive security that surrounded me, but enough to ensure that my family couldn't be used against me by hostile actors. "It's still surreal," Michael admitted. 6 months ago, I was feeling sorry for you because I thought you were struggling to make ends meet. Now I'm learning that my sister is protected by the same security services that guard cabinet members. 6 months ago, you were trying to help someone you thought needed help," I corrected gently. "That intention matters more than the misunderstanding." Our conversation was interrupted by the distinctive chime of my secure phone. Even on Sundays, even during family time, the urgent business of national security never completely stopped. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Director Chen's personal number. "I need to take this," I said, moving toward the secure communications room that adjoined the kitchen. "It should only be a few minutes." "Director Chen," I answered, stepping into the soundproofed space where I conducted classified conversations. "Senator Morrison," came the familiar voice of the CIA director. "I apologize for calling on Sunday, but we've received intelligence about a potential terrorist threat that requires immediate committee oversight." As she briefed me on the developing situation, I found myself thinking about the parallel realities of my life. In the kitchen, my family was probably discussing baby names and nursery colors, the normal concerns of people building ordinary lives. In this secured room, I was learning about threats that could affect thousands of lives, making decisions that would ripple through intelligence networks around the world. But for the first time in 6 years, these realities didn't feel like contradictions. They felt like different aspects of the same whole. A woman who served her country at the highest levels, while maintaining relationships with the people who loved her most. When I returned to the kitchen 15 minutes later, my family looked up with the concerned attention of people who had learned to recognize the weight of the conversations I conducted in that secure room. "Everything all right?" my father asked, his voice carrying the kind of paternal concern that was still new to our relationship. "Nothing immediate," I said, which was true. The threat Director Chen had described was serious, but not imminent, requiring careful monitoring rather than emergency response. Just intelligence that needs to be tracked. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture of comfort that still surprised me with its warmth. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "This life you've chosen, the isolation, the security concerns, the inability to live normally?" The question was one I had asked myself countless times over the past 6 years, but never more frequently than in the months since my revelation. Did I regret choosing service over conventional success? Did I regret the sacrifices that had cost me normal relationships, ordinary freedoms, simple pleasures? "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I don't regret it. This work matters in ways that are hard to explain. The decisions I make, the oversight I provide, the relationships I maintain with intelligence agencies around the world, they help keep people safe. They help preserve the democratic institutions that make ordinary life possible." I looked around the table at my family, seeing the acceptance in their faces that had replaced the confusion and disappointment of earlier years. "But I do regret the cost it imposed on our relationships," I continued. "I regret the years we lost because I couldn't find a way to be honest about who I was becoming. I regret that you thought I was failing when I was actually succeeding beyond anything I had ever imagined." Michael leaned forward, his expression serious in the way that had become familiar when he was processing the implications of my real life. "Rachel," he said, "I need you to know something. These past 6 months, learning about your work, understanding what you actually do, it's changed how I think about success, about achievement, about what really matters." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I make good money, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished in business, but you're protecting democracy itself. You're preventing wars, stopping cyber attacks, maintaining the balance of power that keeps the world stable. What I do is important to shareholders and customers. What you do is important to civilization." The words hit me with unexpected force. For so many years, I had craved his respect, had wanted my family to understand that my choices had value. Now that understanding had arrived, and it felt both vindication and relief. "What we both do matters," I said. "Democracy needs successful businesses, innovative companies, economic growth. It also needs people willing to work in the shadows to protect those institutions. We're both serving the same larger purpose, just in different ways." As the morning progressed, we talked about the future, about Michael and Jennifer's child, about my mother's plans to volunteer with a veterans organization, about my father's interest in auditing courses on international relations. We discussed the practical realities of our new family dynamic, the security protocols that would govern future gatherings, the ways we could maintain closeness while respecting the demands of my position. But more than anything, we talked about the possibility of being honest with each other, of building relationships based on truth, rather than careful deception. For the first time in my adult life, I could be completely myself with the people who mattered most, not the struggling government employee they had pitied, not the powerful senator they were still learning to understand, but simply Rachel Morrison, a woman who had found her calling in service to something larger than herself. As my parents prepared to leave that afternoon, my father paused at the door, looking back with an expression that combined pride, love, and perhaps a touch of amazement. "Senator Morrison," he said formally, then smiled. "My daughter, I'm proud of who you've become, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades of misunderstanding finally resolved. As I watched them walk through the security checkpoints that protected my home, I realized that the revelation at Michael's engagement party hadn't just exposed my secret. It had freed me to finally be whole. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing classified briefings for the week ahead, surrounded by the evidence of my real life. Secure communications equipment, intelligence reports, strategic analyses that would inform congressional decisions affecting millions of lives. But on my desk, beside the encrypted tablets and classified documents, sat a framed photograph from Michael's engagement party, the four of us together, taken just minutes before the emergency call that had changed everything. Looking at that photograph, I saw the last moment of the old reality, the final instant, when I was still the family disappointment, rather than the senator they were learning to respect. But I also saw the foundation that had made our transformation possible, love that had survived misunderstanding, family bonds that had proved stronger than deception, relationships that could be rebuilt on the foundation of truth. The woman in that photograph was keeping secrets that protected her family from complications they couldn't understand. The woman reading intelligence reports in this secure study was protecting her country from threats most citizens would never know existed. But they were the same person, finally integrated, finally whole, finally able to be both Senator Morrison and Rachel, daughter and public servant, family member and guardian of national security. The phone would ring again tomorrow, with new crises, new decisions, new responsibilities that came with the territory of serving at the highest levels of government. But for the first time in 6 years, when those calls came, I wouldn't have to choose between my duty and my family. I could be both the woman who loved them and the senator who served them, finally free to be completely myself in both worlds that mattered most. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.